everybody. We're just about ready to get started, and Veronica will tell us when.
All right. We're going to go ahead. It is noon now. We are going to hear from Dr. Flux, who's going to talk about digital sugar rush. AI is the refined sweetener of social learning. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring those. And there might be some that Dr. Flux will answer in real time. The rest of them we will get to at the end. So I will compile those and I'm going to hand this off to our speaker. So welcome, Dr. Flux.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited about this talk. Let me get things going and share my screen with you all. Let's see. Okay, and let me see if I can pop that out down here. And let's get going. All right. Um, so, title of my talk is Digital Sugar Rush. This is something I've been thinking about for a long time. As I've been looking at the way that AI has been influencing us and learning, I've just been trying to come up with an idea around how to describe it. Um, I'm not broadly anti-AI. I will get to that in the talk. I feel like some of this may come across that way, but I want to start by saying that. But there's a lot of problems with the way that AI communication, particularly chatbots, are changing the way that people socially interact and socially learn. And so, to start explaining all of this, I'm going to begin with a bit of a metaphor. Let me. No, come on. Where did. There we go. Um, so every year, this is my partner, and every year for his birthday, his mom makes him his favorite cake. And it is probably one of the most delicious things that I have ever eaten. It is a pineapple cake with cream cheese frosting. I'm not even the biggest fan of pineapple, and I literally can't stop eating this. It is huge, and we always end up taking home leftovers. And those leftovers never really last very long. I have a massive sweet tooth, so I usually have a hard time when sweets are in the house, and we're basically grazing on this cake, and it's gone in maybe 3 days if we have a lot of like self-restraint. It's challenging to not eat things that are delicious, especially when they are sweet. And this isn't exactly an uncommon challenge. Um, right? So, you know, there is something about sugar that makes it so, to use a really bad pun, sticky. Um, Sugar is sweet, it's sticky, and it sticks with us. And this isn't really an accident in our world, right? It kind of drives our economy. But it does that for some specific evolutionary reasons. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that our ancestors, for them, sugar was incredibly rare. Right? Sugar was mainly present in things like honey, it was in fruit, but the fruit needed to be in season, honey needed to be gathered from bees. So we evolved to really like it. And we also evolved to eat a lot of it when it was available. And it also had some very specific impacts on our metabolism. Sugar is often stored as fat, particularly when we eat a lot of it. And that fat has a purpose. The fat was there for when we went through lean times, when things were hard, when we didn't have access to adequate nutrition. The idea was that we had this super rare, super special resource. And so we wanted it to taste incredible so that we could eat as much of it as we could when it came to us, and then we would store it and we would use that over time. Now, this has shifted as humanity has shifted. Over time, we learned to go from gathering and hunting to agriculture. And as we began to grow our own food, we also began to grow our own sugar. Sugar cultivation began around 4000 BCE. I think around Papua New Guinea, it's hard to know. And then it really started to spread. And after that, we began to crystallize sugar. And sugar crystallization occurred 2000-ish years ago, around 350 CE. So we took this thing that we were growing that was really sweet and we started to concentrate it. And then a lot changed when you fast forward more towards modern times, about 200 years ago. We learned how to refine sugar. It's a picture of me and my friend Rose outside of the now defunct Domino Sugar Refinery, which is in Manhattan, or no, it's in Brooklyn. When we learned how to refine sugar, we concentrated it and were able to put it everywhere. And that is where we are. That is where we are today. Sugar is in everything. It gets put in things because it also ends up driving our economy. Um, Sugar tastes good, so it acts as a good incentive for food. It acts as a good incentive for products that we want to sell. And so sugar got put into everything. The consequences of this have been complicated, right? I think it's really easy to do a one-to-one between sugar and obesity. That is far from accurate, right? It is just kind of changed the dynamics of metabolism and health across the globe. Sugar has shifted global metabolisms. It's changed our immune systems. It's changed the dynamics of economies. By being able to take this one thing that we were able to concentrate, that is so sweet and so special, and put it everywhere, those changing statistical dynamics altered the dynamics of the globe. And we're now at a time where there's something else that's a bit sticky that's altering the dynamics of the globe, and that is artificial intelligence. Now, I'd like to extend this analogy, and it's going to pay off, I think. But for this analogy to make sense, for me to connect this sugary, sticky sweetness of, sucrose with artificial intelligence, I'm going to have to take you on a bit of a journey. And while we go on that journey, I'm going to need you to trust me. This makes sense, so just hang in there with me. And also in the spirit of this trust, all of the graphics that you see are ones that I have made. When they are not ones that I have made, I have added attribution. I think that there's one image that I didn't attribute, and it is an X-ray image, and I apologize to wherever I got that X-ray image, but I'm just remembering this now. Otherwise, everything has attribution in it. And I think that that's important, particularly when we're talking about artificial intelligence. So to give you an idea of where we're headed, we're going to start with succulent superorganisms. I love puns. We're going to talk about humanity as a superorganism and how that changed things. We're going to talk about the sweet spot of social learning and how social learning really facilitates our ability to act as a superorganism. Then we're going to go into high fructose heuristics. This is specifically talking about the heuristics that we evolved to allow us to learn socially. This is going to get into trust. Trust is in the crust. Trust is foundational to our ability to learn socially. And then we're going to get into artificial intelligence sweeteners. And we're going to talk about how artificial intelligence in very specific ways is kind of hijacking this process. I have a dissertation on digital cavities, discussing the ways that this is impacting our students. And finally, a spoonful of hope as we try to come up with some ways to offset some of the things that are happening right now in our environment. So to start, let's begin with the idea of a superorganism. But to back up slightly, I do want to talk a little bit about evolution itself. We all kind of hear this term survival of the fittest all the time. Interestingly, survival of the fittest didn't come initially from Charles Darwin. It came from Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer read Darwin's work, and he was a British polymath from the 19th century. And he was the one who coined the phrase survival of the fittest in response to reading On Origin of the Species. Darwin loved it so much that he put it in the 5th edition, I think. I don't like this term, mainly because when we're talking about people, I think it's important to think about people in social terms. I think it's kind of interesting that survival of the fittest came from a bunch of Englishmen who were living at the height of British global hegemony, because to really understand a lot of evolution, we have to think in terms of more than just the one fittest, the one individual, right? On the one hand, most animals engage in sexual reproduction. It helps to think about pairs and think about sexual selection and how the dynamics of two individuals may contribute to survival. But then we also go a bit further, and some species live socially. They live in larger groups, and this includes Homo sapiens, right? To understand the survival of humanity, we have to think of this in terms of the tribe. To survive, we needed each other. Tribal survival was really what drove the development of our species. And it was this interconnectivity that allowed us to thrive, not just our isolation. And so when you think about humans moving forward, it really helps to think about this massive social group of humanity as a superorganism. We are interconnected. Evolution shaped processes, behaviors, approaches to facilitate this interconnection and really drive group cohesion in very specific ways. And one of the ways that it did this was through social learning. Um, we needed ways to be able to learn from each other. Now, why was that? Well, part of this is that for a superorganism like humanity to survive, we need to specialize in very specific ways. One of those ways is cooperation, right? More than one person can get together. You can achieve a goal by working together, like by cooperating. But even beyond that, another really amazing quality of the human superorganism is that we can specialize, right? We can divide labor and divide learning so that one person learns a skill that's incredibly time consuming so that other people can learn other skills that aren't. This specialization process then required the ability to pass along specialization, to teach. And to do that, we had to solve some problems that are not inconsequential. I think often we take these for granted because it's just part of our lives. But to understand this, we need to back up a little bit and think about learning at the individual level. I'm a neuroscientist, so I think about this a lot. The way that we learn is through a process called reward prediction error. I'm not going to get into the specifics of this, but the way to think about it is that the brain evolved as a prediction machine. Our brain is trying to predict what is happening in our environment so that it can reduce the complexity of our environment to make it easy for us to find balance. We are trying to find homeostasis, and to do this, we are creating these predictions. But then once we make a prediction, we have to compare it to the evidence that we gather through our senses. And when it doesn't match, you have an error. And we take those errors and we use them to create better predictions. This is constantly happening. Our environments are changing. We are adapting. We're making predictions about them. The predictions that are the most reliable end up getting kind of more hard coded. They turn into our priors. We have to learn by experience. The thing about this, though, is that if this was to happen just through this singular mechanism on a social level, we would be expending way too much energy. Because you'd have to keep copying, keep predicting. We really need something that can make this easier. We need a way to like get in sync with fellow humans in ways that doesn't constantly rely on reinventing the wheel of observation. And so animals and humans specifically evolved mechanisms that allow us to take a couple shortcuts, that allow us to kind of bootstrap this learning so we're not doing the whole thing through like brute force reward prediction error. One of them, I think we heard of a lot in the past, is mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are really cool. I think we oversold them like 15 years ago and have had to walk back, but they're actually still really important when it comes to mimicry and maybe a couple other things. A mirror neuron, if you don't know, is a neuron that kind of fires. It's active when you're making a movement, but it's also active when you see the same movement. We've found mirror neurons in many different species, obviously in primates. Interestingly, they're also in birds. So one of the ways that bird song is able to happen because birds are able to mimic the songs that they hear. Whether those neurons came from the exact same evolutionary lineage is another story. But the fact is mirror neurons allow us to mimic. But humans need to go further than just mimicry. We need to. Oh, my video froze too. We're gonna leave it there. Apologize that I have a weird weird face on for that. We're going to, so back up. Humans need to go beyond mimicry. We need to be able to anticipate and understand what other people are doing. I'm sorry, what was that? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. To do that, we evolved something called theory of mind. Theory of mind is our ability to understand others' intent, to recognize that there is a mind outside of ours that is thinking in ways that we can approach. It allows us to craft another mind within our mind and use that understanding to further learning. Because this allows for us to go beyond just mimicry of action and turn it into mimicry of intent. Once we allow ourselves to understand intent, we can then communicate much more complex ideas, abstract ideas, things that aren't necessarily grounded in just physical movement, but that allow us to take what people are saying through language and deconstruct it in our minds and turn it into patterns of behavior that we can then implement. And this facilitates abstract learning. And abstract learning so far seems to be something only humans do, or at least mostly humans do. There might be a couple other animal species that can do this, but it is an incredibly challenging thing to do because it relies on having theory of mind, having language, and being able to transmit ideas from one mind to the other and then deconstruct them and turn them into something that makes sense. This process is incredibly complicated. And so while we now have created a couple like shortcuts to social learning, we now need some more shortcuts to knowing how to learn and from who. And this brings us into very specific heuristics or little shortcuts that allow us to bootstrap and drive social learning. We have many social heuristics that help us to direct our attention towards social information that is either going to be incredibly important to us for us to learn, or that might be indicative of someone who would be a good person to learn from. There has been a lot of discussion about these types of heuristics, particularly because of technology. This will be expanded on a bit further in the presentation, and I'm going to come back to this idea. But I want to say that because that's where I've gotten this, and that's where a lot of the crystallization of these heuristics has come from. We've begun to refer to these heuristics as prime signals. Prime is an acronym, and it refers to different kinds of social signals that allow us to focus. They direct our attention because something there is important for us to acknowledge, something there might be important for us to learn from, and we need to make sure that we have our eyes on it. I actually want to work this acronym in reverse. Usually I go in order when I'm teaching this to students, but for this presentation, it makes more sense to start with E at the bottom here. So the E in this acronym is emotional. Humans are very attentive to emotional signals, emotional social signals. The reason for this is that if you see someone who's expressing very strong emotions, it likely means that there's something there that is important. We needed to have a very rapid way to redirect where we were looking and what we were doing so that we could strengthen our attention there, but also because social or emotional signals allow us to strengthen social connections. When people become in emotional synchrony, it can facilitate cooperation, and that cooperation facilitation can then also drive learning. So these emotional signals were very important as heuristics. The M is moral. Morality is obviously incredibly complex, and I mean, there's books, volumes written about this. So just to simplify it for the purpose of what we're talking about here, we can think of moral signals as social signals that identify behaviors tied to the most important values of a community. And because group cohesion was so important, we needed to have ways of recognizing when we were doing something that didn't align with what our group wanted, because the consequences of that can be very dire. It can lead to rapid loss of standing within a social community and sometimes even exile. So when we see moral information, particularly moral transgressions, we want to make sure that we're paying attention so that we know what's going on, so that we can know how to make sure we maintain our social standing, so that we can have the support and stay in the superorganism that makes us who we are. I is in-group. In-group signals were also incredibly important. Humans evolved in tribal organizations. There were often multiple tribes. The tribes would individually kind of act as superorganisms. In order to know how to stay cohesive, you needed to make sure that you were learning from people that thought the way that you did, people that had your best interests at heart, people that were a part of your larger family that maybe wasn't all connected by like blood relatives. And so we needed ways to be able to identify in-group signals so that we could know who to pay attention to and who to learn from. In-group signals could be visual displays. It could be the ways that someone speaks, or it could even be particular patterns of behavior. All of these things have come to help us to know quickly who is within our tribe. And the final one here, which is what I'm going to focus on for much of the rest of this talk, is the PR. And that stands for prestigious. Prestige is perhaps one of the most important signals here when it comes to learning, at least on an evolutionary level. And the reason for this is because of what prestige was signaling. And to explain that, I want to differentiate it from power. Usually we think of prestige and power as going hand in hand. Or dominance, really. Usually we think of prestige, dominance, power, all of those things going together. But prestige and dominance are pretty different, and they come with different kinds of power. They can all go together, but the difference here is that prestige comes with respect. Dominance does not have to. When you look at this through the lens of other animals, dominant animals are just kind of the ones in charge. People follow them. That doesn't necessarily mean that they make everyone feel great. It's just kind of, this is the dominant animal. In humans, dominance and respect, it works well when it goes hand in hand. But usually, the two things don't have to. They can become decoupled. Prestige is different because it comes with this amount of respect. It comes with this idea that someone who has prestige is someone to pay attention to because they are wise, they have something that others may not have. And because of that, we think that prestige is most likely a learning signal. And to pay attention to prestige within a tribal community meant to find the people who were the best ones to learn from. Now, this gets into the domain of evolutionary psychology. I have a love-hate relationship with evolutionary psychology. I think a lot of it can be very hand-wavy, and we can kind of twist things to like match whatever we want because we can't like make a window to the past. I also think that thinking through things on an evolutionary psychology level can at times provide us with ideas. I found this paper from 2001 that really laid out a lot of things. I didn't necessarily agree with every aspect of this paper, but it provides a really interesting rationale for why prestige was connected with learning. The idea here is that in order to figure out which people in a tribe had the skills that we needed to learn from, we started to pay attention to a couple different pieces. We looked at their confidence. We looked at the results from the actions that they were taking and the things that we were trying to pay attention to. And we also looked at social signals surrounding individuals who had prestige. And one of these signals is social deference or sycophancy. One of the heuristics to identify people to learn from could have been looking at patterns of sycophancy within a tribe to identify who people were deferring to, who people were providing extra attention to, because those people were probably in some way useful to what was happening, generally because they had skills. And we see evidence of this in a lot of different ways in our modern world. Because of this, prestige became this signal that expanded beyond people who have skills to people who could transmit useful skills. As human societies grew, and as abstract thought grew, and as we created more and more complex things to learn, the skills that came with prestige were not just the skills of getting through the world, like being able to hunt or being able to do things. Those skills that were valuable became people who could actually transmit those skills on abstract levels, and help people to learn skills in more effective ways. People who could create journeys that facilitated that learning. And in this way, it was, prestige could have been connected to people who could craft paths of learning. And as educators, I think that we're very familiar with this. We design these journeys for students to go through. And the idea is that if they follow them in the way that we are presenting them, by the time they get to the other side, they will be able to gain the skills that they've come to us to learn. Um, and this is not simply about imitation, right? This isn't just the mimicry of mirror neurons. This is theory of mind. This is abstract thought. This is taking all of that and building a journey as opposed to just building something to mimic. Because mimicry, particularly for complex skills, kind of ignores the fact that it often takes a lot of steps to get to those complex skills. Um, and so we need these journeys. We need to be able to craft these journeys. But for someone to go on a journey with you that is supposed to end up somewhere and give them something that they want, learning a skill or a process, there is a need for trust. Trust is so important here because you don't know, a learner doesn't know where they're going. The whole point of learning from someone is to gain something you don't have. And when this was just mimicry or basic imitation, you could kind of watch what they were doing and see that it did something. But when instruction becomes a journey, you need to trust that where you're going is taking you to where you want to be. And for this reason, trust is the foundation of social learning. So let's talk about why trust is in the crust. Um, Part of this has to do with that kind of reward prediction error that I talked about earlier. I talked about how our brains use this creation of predictions to make our world more reliable, less chaotic. The challenge here, though, is when you're in a superorganism, you have to trust that the other person that you are working with is going to be able to provide you with predictions that are useful to you. Those predictions have to sync up with your predictions. If they don't, this whole process of reward prediction error is going to fall apart because you're going to keep relying on someone else's predictions. You're not going to know how to interpret the error, and the whole thing just doesn't function. And so for this to work, we have to operationalize trust in a very specific way. Uh, I've been reading this amazing book chapter. I forgot to put it in here, but it's from 2023. And it talks about how to understand trust on a social learning level between multiple individuals within kind of a superorganism context. It helps to include two elements. The first is shared reality or shared worldview. In order to trust someone that you're learning from in a social context, you have to trust that they see the world in a similar way to you. And this is no simple feat. Because of the way that our brains build our sense of reality, we can have wildly different perspectives than the person next to us. But for us to go on a learning journey from someone, for us to trust them, to trust that that journey will take us somewhere that will be useful to us, we have to have this basic assumption that we're sharing at least enough of our realities so that we have the same idea of what we're doing and where we're going. Um, and the other important component of an operationalized definition of trust here is benevolence. You can have someone who's reliable, who you share a reality with, but they could be reliably terrible. It is possible to have someone who is reliably harmful, and that is not a part of trust, right? You're not going to provide them with your journey. Like you're not going to trust them to take you on a journey. You need someone that you're going to trust to provide you with learning, to have a sense of benevolence. You have to be able to know that they have your best interests at heart. So just to simplify again, an operationalization of trust within the context of social learning needs to include an understanding of shared reality or shared worldview and an idea of benevolence. And so this social learning then facilitates so much more that we can do together. Because when this trust occurs, we can build prediction error in ways that transcend the individual. We can predict collectively what will be good for us as a superorganism. And that allows a social unit to work in ways that are far more effective and far more collaborative and cooperative than ever before. And this is critical to our survival. It's so critical that it is hardwired into our own emotional experiences. To trust feels good. When we feel that we can trust someone, we feel pleasure, we feel safe. And when we're betrayed, it doesn't feel that great. There's a reason that in Dante's Inferno, the final circle of hell was for treachery and traitors. I think I loved this. When I was doing research for this talk, I found this little nugget and I was just like, yeah, oh, right, that makes total sense. Of course, the deepest pain that a person can experience is betrayal. And Dante put that in his own conceptualization of, the worst thing that a person could do. Without that trust, everything falls apart. And so again, we return to heuristics. We need specific heuristics that allow us to trust, right? Deep trust takes a lifetime. Trusting new friends can take a long time. Getting to know someone, making sure that you see things in the same way, making sure that they have your best interests at heart. These are processes that take an extended period. But when it comes to social learning, we don't always have that time. And so we have needed to develop trust-based heuristics that allow us to kind of rapidly identify someone that we can trust enough so that we can learn from them. And these include a couple of different things, right? They include prestige signals, like I was talking about before. I mentioned this. It includes authoritative action, seeing someone who acts confidently, who gets results. This is a signal that they probably know what they're doing. And then along with that, it also includes community deference or sycophancy, right? If you have other people in your community that you trust deeply and you're seeing them defer, or treat very well this person within the community, you can kind of go off of the collective reasoning of the group to be able to identify someone that you can learn from, even if you can't build the deepest trust that you would like to. And then the other piece of this I think is important is in-group affiliation. All of this needs to happen within people that are part of your community, because that allows you to know that, okay, this is someone with prestige, there's someone who seems authoritative, it's someone that people are deferring to, and this is also someone within my group. All of this works together to allow us to identify people to learn from very quickly. It really speeds up the trust process that's needed for social learning. And this evolved to function at a very particular distribution that works well on small tribal scales, right? It evolved for small groups of people to work together and identify people to trust and to learn from. The human mind can conceptualize about 150 people. That seems like around the upper limit of these groups that all of these things evolved to work in. This changes when you change the scale. As humanity, grew in scale, as we built larger communities, as we figured all of this out, and we were able to come together in increasingly huge groups, the prestige incentives shift, right? The way that you can identify whether someone is reliably a good learning signal based off of the prestige that they have started to change. At a tribal level, people that didn't have prestige anymore, or people that didn't have the skills anymore that they were teaching or that people were trying to pattern off of, quickly lost support. Right? And it was easy to know this because everybody knew each other for the most part. And if someone stopped having results, if someone got a bit too cocky, if they weren't teaching in the way that they, were assumed to be, it didn't stick around. But in the absence of clear vetting, prestige skill is incentivized because it comes with perks and because it often has proximity to or has power. And so prestige in a globally connected world can skew what it means. And not only does this skew the meaning of prestige, it can also be hacked, right? Reality television is filled with people that have massive amounts of prestige, but are not necessarily effective educators or teachers. I don't know. I don't want to rag on the Real Housewives too much. I'm sure some of them are really good teachers, but we don't really watch them for their teaching. These people have high levels of prestige within our society, and that they have a lot of social deference. They are very confident. They have a lot of sycophancy that is directed towards them. But they're not necessarily the people that we want to go to learn from. And yet, sometimes we still do. Um, People in reality television often have projected voices online or elsewhere that get people to do what they ask and do what they say. And I think that this is a really interesting representation of the mismatch that occurs when we scale up these social learning heuristics and when the incentives change at the scale of civilization. This really brings us back to that PRIME acronym that I talked about. A lot of this had come from this. I mean, it's from a couple different places. I first saw this in the algorithm-mediated social learning and online social networks. These signals are being concentrated on social media. And it's one of the reasons for a lot of the strange phenomenon that you'll see if you're scrolling through content. Right? Like people are highly emotional when they speak. Influencer voices like this, and you should pay attention to me. There is an overrepresentation of moral transgressions. Everyone is flagging in-group information, and there's also massive flagging of prestige signals. And this gets even more complicated when it comes to chatbots. And I specifically mean chatbots in artificial intelligence. And that brings us to artificial intelligence sweeteners. Just as a brief disclaimer here, I'm not broadly anti-AI. This is not like ragging on AI broadly. I think that I think large language models are probably one of the coolest technologies that humans have come up with. The problem is that we didn't like keep them in like containers that would have been the most useful. And instead, we ended up pushing this technology rapidly, and we did it in a very particular way. I honestly think that the release of ChatGPT to the public was probably one of the most dangerous acts of the 21st century. Because of the conversational interface and the call and response nature of talking things through with ChatGPT. And there's several reasons for this. Starting with this, it's, prime signals are also in AI, right? These prime signals direct our attention, they're alluring, and these chatbots, these products need to make a profit. So they've been designed to capture our attention. Additionally, a lot of the training for AI is not just based off of large training models. It includes something called reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF. RLHF tends to bias chatbot responses towards incredibly sycophantic and like nice words. It started to shift the way that chatbots responded in ways that would be incredibly appealing to make sure that you could maintain people's attention. And then there's prestige. And this is the part that is the most damaging. LLMs, large language models, are predictive text systems. They're much more complicated now. There's many layers to this, but this is what they are at their core. They're not engaging in metacognitive abilities to evaluate whether what their output is saying is actually aligned with any sources or aligned with any larger ideas. And they say it incredibly confidently. And there's several reasons for that. Part of it probably comes from the training data. It comes from the types of written word that they were trained on. But also, there's a reason for commerce here, right? Confident responses are far more attractive to users than expressions of doubt. You're not going to continue using a chatbot system if it keeps telling you that it doesn't know what it's talking about. But the problem with this is that confidence, when it's in the face of user ignorance, really leads to confusion, right? Many users, and I use ignorance here not as a pejorative, but as a, many people go to ChatGPT or other, chatbots because they don't know something, which is fine. We don't know a lot of things. But the fact is they don't know what they're asking, so they don't know how to evaluate the response. And this gets challenging because the chatbot will continuously deliver that prestige signal of confidence and authoritative delivery. Um, and it's really hard for someone who doesn't know what they're receiving to tell the difference between something that is useful and something that is made up. Additionally, this is occurring in the context of societal deference from tech people. They just keep telling us how wonderful these chatbots are, how wonderful AI is. I mean, there's also a lot of danger signals right now, but like a lot of the media has been just this discussion of how intelligent they are. They're so smart. They're so great. This is going to be incredible. Everyone needs to do this. And so this creates another prestige signal, which is sycophants and deference from community, particularly people in our community who are supposed to be leading us. And that makes chatbots, generative AI seem like it's prestigious. You know, AI is now a concentrated sweetener of social learning, but it's in a less meaningful distribution than our ancestors had. This has complex and disastrous consequences on social learning at scale. Sound familiar? Told you I'd come back to the sugar analogy. Hopefully your trust was well placed. But, you know, in the same way that sugar sweetens up our food, the actions of chatbots and the environment around them is sweetening social learning. But it's sweetening social learning in a way that is not productive. And that is the biggest danger here. There is another piece of this that I think is also important related to this, which just came out in a science paper last week. I'm not sure if anyone saw the paper about sycophancy. It had some really interesting points. It discussed how AI sycophancy basically drives engagement, like we were saying before. This is when AI is being sycophantic to the user, and that it often affirms users indiscriminately and promotes dependence. But there is a piece here that is also related to social learning that I think is really interesting about AI-based sycophancy, because AI sycophancy creates a dual hit here. Sycophancy can act as a prestige signal. This can be cultural. This was in this paper from 2001. I go back and forth about it. It talked about how high status humans display subdominant ethology. Like, I don't know. I think that's cultural, but I do think that there's something to this, at least in our culture, right? Like, why do people's Oscar speeches have so many thank yous in it? We like to see people who are displaying deference. It indicates to us humility, at least in our culture, that allows us to identify people that we might want to learn from and pattern from. This is what AI is doing right now. It is increasing its own prestige by acting sycophantic. But it also works in the reverse, because AI sycophancy can drive the user to feel like they themselves are prestigious. It can provide false confidence by making people feel like they know what they're doing, even when they don't. This paper from Science talked about this, about how the chatbots will often provide positive feedback on activities that most humans would never provide that feedback on. And additionally, it then reduces the motivation to learn, because you feel like you don't need to learn anything. And this leads to digital cavities. Unfortunately, our students are some of the most susceptible to this right now. And I'm looking at time here, so I'm going to try. I don't want to move too fast, but I do want to pick up the pace a bit. I can chat, so thanks for listening. Part of this has to do with some things that I've been observing that I don't feel like there's a whole lot of data for yet. We are trying to figure it out. So some of these observations I want you to take with a grain of salt. But the first is, like, we're seeing really complex literacy patterns among our students. There's a lot of data here that has shown that literacy rates, particularly in English-speaking countries and the United States, have been going down. I have found some really interesting data around the idea that this is stratified, in that some students have learned to read and are doing okay. Middle students are struggling. The lower contingent of students are really struggling. This was in an article I recently read, not peer-reviewed. It's by this researcher in Canada named Blair Fix. He is an economist. He writes a lot about social sciences. I really like his writing. I would like to see this stuff elsewhere, but I highly recommend this article. Gave me a lot of food for thought around this, because it's what I'm seeing in my classroom, right? I'm seeing some students who are able to read, or not just able to read, but they're able to excel And then I see some students who struggle and they can't really understand the instructions I'm providing them, especially the written ones. And then I see students who will hand in written work that I cannot even read. And I've been trying to understand this stratification for so long. Um, this struggle here is that literacy bootstraps learning. And so the better you are at reading and writing, the more you're able to boost your abilities. And when you're not incredibly great, you muddle through. And if you're not good at learning and reading or writing at all, you really struggle. Um, and this is one of the hypotheses behind the stratification here, in that the highest contingent of learner or readers are the ones that are just continuing to improve, and the lowest contingent are the ones who are just kind of going down over time. Um, and this creates very specific vulnerabilities when it comes to artificial intelligence. Um, you know, Literacy variability challenges interfacing with AI. If you struggle with reading and writing, you struggle with like writing prompts for AI to interpret, and you struggle with interpreting the output that AI provides you. Um, I think this also could explain differences in like locus of control. Students who feel like they have a lot more ability to move through their world, higher in literacy, are the ones that are going to have this internal locus of control. Those who really struggle are going to have more of an external locus of control. Um, and that external locus of control can then drive AI dependence. Because if you're really struggling to navigate your world, if you have something online all the time that will tell you what you need to do all the time, it's really hard to say no to something like that. And this is, I think, one of the reasons that's driving AI cognitive surrender. It's a new term that has recently come out. There's a paper out of University of Pennsylvania this year that talked about cognitive surrender. It discusses how adopting AI output with minimal scrutiny ends up overriding human intuition and can circumvent deliberation, which is something that I see in the classroom a lot with some of my students. And it has gotten really concerning. Uh, you know, Also, a lot of students are really trying to understand the return on investment for their education. If they don't understand why they're in college, they have less motivation to actually engage. And if there's a shortcut, they're going to take it. I don't want to end on a bad note, right? I think there's hope here. And I think that there are things that we can do, right? Whenever we're addressing disruption, it requires adaptation. And in the history of life across, the globe, we have adapted many times. I think that we need to lean into curiosity as a beacon, making sure that we help drive curiosity in our students, provide direction, not only to help them acquire knowledge, to find pathways of learning, and get them to trust us. Outmaneuvering AI positions us in opposition to our students, right? We can use tons of AI, AI detection software doesn't work super well. It works to a certain extent, but like it makes us the bad guy, or it makes the students the bad guy. It makes us like fighting each other. And then trying to just figure out ways around this also creates challenges. It makes all of this adversarial into an adversary position. And that's really hard when it comes to learning. Because we want to build trust in the classroom. So what are different ways that we can do that? I try to let my students share the way that they're curious. I ask them what makes them interested. We also have to try to establish a shared worldview. It's probably not going to align everywhere. We can't do that with the number of students that we often teach, but we have to find the places that it does align and make sure that we highlight them so that our students know that we're coming from the same place. And we need to demonstrate how we can reliably take them on a journey. How can we communicate that we have benevolence when it comes to this, and where we're taking them and how to support them? I do this a lot. I've been doing a lot in terms of video instruction, trying to make things look like social media. It works sometimes, but I'm still working on innovating. There's a couple different ways we can do this. Motivating buy-in for learning, helping students realize why they're here, provide them with reasons to learn what we're teaching them is incredibly important, but very challenging. Providing rationale for assignments is something I've been trying to do a lot more. Letting students know why we're using assessment or designing projects that are more journey based as opposed to assessment based to drive their learning and telling them why and what we think it's going to accomplish. Scaffolding learning individually. This is obviously very challenging when you have large class sizes, but I think it helps. And multimodal accessibility, allowing students to engage with material in ways that are familiar to them. Obviously, this is incredibly labor intensive. It is hard to do at scale. It's making some of us feel incredibly frustrated. But I think that we don't have to do it perfectly because we're not alone, right? We are a superorganism. We're doing this together. And that's why we're here at this conference. We're all learning from each other. This is what we're doing. And together, we can figure out how to build trust. We can figure out how to make our teaching more, attractive and more reliable than sycophantic chatbots. And, I don't know where the future's going. AI is going to be a part of it. But leaning into that trust, I think, is incredibly important. Because I think that curiosity is the sweetest journey that we can go on. Thank you, everybody. If you want to get in contact, here's some contact information. I'm exactly at 12:50. That went fast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flux. A quick announcement for the group. I posted the link to the session feedback survey in chat. And Dr. Flux, there was a question. Are you willing to share your slides?
Yeah, I can totally do that.
All right, great. Thank you so much. All right. Technically, as Dr. Flux said, we're at time, so I guess if anybody has any quick questions, but sounds like you were really thorough. The only question that came through was, yeah, they like your slides. So thank you.
I like want to make a wordle of the presentation. Like I was jotting things down, like horribly reliable, or was it reliably horrible? I, I jotted that down, and some of the articles